He has a wealth of experience in the risk management industry, including focus in sub-Saharan Africa. So he's a wonderful speaker to have at this session. More than 25 years of experience in international project finance and development. He's worked for U.S. government agencies, including OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, where he focused on major infrastructure projects in Africa and the Middle East. He's currently the Vice President of Alliant Insurance Services Emerging Markets Unit, and that involves underwriting and brokering political risk and trade credit insurance for many countries in Africa and worldwide. He currently works with oil and gas production and exploration companies, independent power producers, financial institutions, telecommunication and internet service providers, and agricultural businesses. He has experience leading high-level negotiations with financial institutions, U.S. government agencies like the World Bank and other development finance institutions and foreign government agencies. And these are in part through project due diligence work. So this experience gives him a great vantage point to give us some pointers and his thoughts on finance and risk management in sub-Saharan Africa. So Mr. Duffy, thank you so much for coming and being with us.
My name sometimes, and I've been working in Africa a lot of times, kind of interesting, it's Irish, but people not, Margaret was saying, on the phone you might sound like somebody else. I've been greeted in Senegal and other places, people put a sign out and they spell my name with some kind of African spelling. Conal doesn't sound like some kind of name, but anyway, I very much feel like an African, although I'm Irish American. Before I begin my formal remarks, I'd like to thank the African Business Club. It is a sincere honor to be a panelist today at this first African Business Conference. And I sincerely hope that my remarks aren't so provocative that the result will not be able to have another one. The topic that I've been given is myths versus realities. Myths of doing business in Africa and realities of doing business. Many of the myths about doing business in Africa stem from dated impressions. 25 years ago, when I began having a front row seat to Africa's transformations, and that began as a Peace Corps volunteer in Mali. Much of the Africa that I worked in was very poor. Governments were hardly functional or representative. The commercial class was steeped in corruption and heavily reliant upon former colonial era contacts for everything, from goods to financing at high interest rates on the goods that they had largely purchased from Europe. Today, there may be a good many, including this audience, who would say that Africa hasn't changed all that much in the last 25 years. But generously, they would admit that some things have changed, but that much, a whole lot, needs to be done to really say that Africa's renaissance is occurring. Additionally, you may also hear folks say, well, it's nice to see Africa's economy is improving, but they really don't add up too much compared to other regions. Piling on, people will say that Africa's problems are endemic, from corruption to illness to wars to climate patterns, and so on and so on. The deluge that would appear from all of this in the post-colonial period is years from being over. Many of Africa's myths, then, are stark negatives, suggesting that any success that Africa has had is fragile and of little actual consequence. We've heard our other speakers today refute parts of that story, providing hope that the good days are increasingly coming into view and that there is staying power behind that progress. I'll add my voice to second much of that, and also suggest here that Africa has very much indeed made great strides and its future is becoming brighter by the day. Before going there, though, let's look a little bit at how this change has come about. But before going there, let's blame the World Bank, the IMF, USAID, and most every other bilateral, multilateral agency for Africa's problems, and then give them credit for helping to fix the problems that they created. Talk about job protection. Africa in the 1980s and much of the 90s was heavily indebted. The debt had gone for good things, building roads, schools, etc., but in many countries, Tanzania to name one, very little of that money actually was spent as intended. Instead, it led to great opportunities for corruption, and just about every government in Africa paid their civil servants low wages, effectively winking at them to make up their incomes elsewhere. That debt was also multi-edged. During the Cold War, it aligned African countries with the West or the East. Infrastructure projects were built to please African political leaders, as opposed to being the product of good planning, assessment of community requirements, or to truly promote local investment and trade. I've seen beautiful roads in Africa that were built to go to leaders' villages, while roads between port cities and upcountry were a series of elephant traps, with deep craters big enough to swallow buses and trucks with room for more. Factories built in the noble name of import substitution or self-reliance largely produced paychecks for politically connected managers, along with low-quality goods that consumers had no other choice but to buy. Also, many of the countries in Africa had either nationalized key industries or created monopolies for state-owned companies. The contest for control of that golden goose of a government job, to be a member of the kleptocracy, resulted in a high number of coups and, very sadly, great suffering, wars, lack of investment, basic health, education, etc. With this instability omnipresent, capital, a coward as they said, fled the continent, along the way becoming its largest exporter. But now let's turn the page, as I just have. Go forward a few years and praise the IMF, the World Bank, and USAID. Let's also throw in Bono, Professors Collier and Sachs, Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush, and others who fought hard for debt relief. I'll add and perhaps also introduce Thomas Sankara. A little bit more about him in a few moments. That heavy indebtedness in many African economies had made their governments highly reliant upon donors, as we've seen, particularly as a number of them were true basket cases. That same dependency, particularly after the end of the Cold War, the end of the East versus West conflict, now became the carrot for change. The heavily indebted poor country, or HIPIC programs in the 1990s and the early part of the last decade, exchanged debt relief for a range of things, from opening up the political process, to privatization, even the reforms that sea change, reduced opportunities for corruption. Now, for the last 20 some odd years, the IMF, World Bank, and others have been on the bandwagon for keeping concessionary lending to a minimum, promoting private sector growth, and helping foreign investment and trade development. That change in tune, thankfully, has had repercussions throughout the continent. As a result of this, we've now witnessed over the last 15 years economic growth in Africa that has heretofore not been heard of. Good commodity prices definitely have contributed towards this. And whereas in the 1970s and 80s, when the World Bank and others had promoted borrowing against those high commodity prices, now these same agencies are telling governments to get the private sector to build the ports and the roads and the homes that can be paid for by the income generated from these higher commodity prices. In some countries, gasp, the greatest number of new government jobs out there are in the tax bureaus for young people. Why? Because young people are becoming, they're entering the middle class and they're having to file tax returns for the very first time. So somebody has to go in there and audit them. It goes against the grain in one of the few countries to be on this liberalization path. So the servants of plenty look fondly back to the good old days when they controlled large budgets, negotiated big projects with donors, and could make plenty of money off of their government positions. With HIPIC in the rearview mirror and the economy is doing well, a lot of politicians and activists, local as well as international, even some in the World Bank and elsewhere, have been promoting indigenization, sorry for me to say, or goals for local ownership and employment. It's hard not to applaud this idea. Economic growth has been uneven. While the middle classes blossom, large numbers of people are working for small wages or continue to be subsistence farmers. Universities are overflowing. Jobs for graduates are sparse. The challenge, therefore, is how to translate this good idea into good economic policy. Foreign local investment has been a real driver behind Africa's economic growth. Meanwhile, the purpose associated with commodity prices has returned in a number of countries. Governments awash in new revenues are building ports and power plants on their own, things that they had agreed would be done by the private sector. Let's also keep in mind that this progress, this epoch in Africa's history, when its economies have grown and diversified, it's only gone on for a few years. It's true that foreign and local investors have been making bigger and bigger investments, but Africa's needs for investment dwarf what's presently going on. This, in the view of many African officials and pundits, means that the reforms that they have undertaken have not been rewarded. Talk about President Obasanjo. He often spoke of the unapparent democracy dividend, the the idea that he opened up the economy and few cared to take a look. So what to do? In my view, the paradigm has shifted towards the good, and now the private sector, foreign and local investors must get in to preserve the path forward. Without this investment, government officials can point their fingers and say, see, the private sector needs our help, can't do it all, far from it, we'll do what we used to do, and back to where we were. Capital, meanwhile, knows all we know, as we all know, is a coward. Even if the returns are very high, with risk comes reward, few may show up. This is where our practice, what I do for a living, comes into the picture. We work to mitigate the risks involved in doing business in Africa, as well as the rest of the world. Political risk, trade credit insurance, and other forms of insurance and various guarantees can be used to transfer the risks. From adverse government policy changes to war, civil unrest, non-payment, expropriation, breach of contract, that investors and lenders are not willing to bear. We begin by identifying and quantifying exposures to particular risks, and then uniquely, and instead of perhaps making it all sound so scary, we use that information to craft risk transfer solutions. We broker insurance with public and private market insurers, all designed to address our clients' requirements to reduce perceived political and payment risks. Thankfully, the perception of risk hasn't entirely been the reality as far as insurance claims are concerned. The private market insurers now dominate issuance of projects in Africa. If losses were higher, you wouldn't see this. Also, rates are generally pretty good. Not everywhere, however. Indeed, insurers are no less of a coward at times themselves. The risk has to be pretty good going in for the insurers to participate. Before going forward, I mentioned Thomas Sankara before. I don't know his entire history, and perhaps not the best figure to bring up in this discussion. He came to power in a coup, ruled by force, and was killed by soldiers controlled by his successor, and now de facto president for life. He also renamed the country Burkina Faso, combining words from two dominant languages of his country, formerly known as Upper Volta. Not a bad thing to do, rebranding your country in this fashion. But it seemed to be a lesser priority to do something like that when the country otherwise was at or near the bottom of every quality of life survey. Changing direction, however, was a big part of Thomas's plans. His coming to power in a coup in 1983 was followed by dividing the spoils with his military supporters. Unlike other coup leaders of this time period, though, he wasn't a senior military leader. He was also from another generation, born at the end of the colonial period. Additionally, he'd become friends with a Peace Corps volunteer in his home village. The two of them would meet every so often, and the Peace Corps director from that time has told me that the volunteer would go to Ouagadougou to visit him, now his buddy, President Sankara, going through the front gates, wearing flip-flops and jeans, like I used to, walking past guards with Uzis and shot up Toyota Land Cruisers nearby. Thomas is alleged to have aligned his country, as was the thinking in those days, for countries either with the West or the East. He was accused of aligning his country with Cuba. Far more interesting and relevant here was that he sought debt relief. He attacked corruption. Famously, he sent inspectors down to see who was working in different government offices. If they weren't at their desk at 8 a.m., they were fired. His speeches were filled with vitriol for officials who took paychecks and bribes and who didn't do any work. When I first traveled to Burkina in 1988, less than a year after he'd been assassinated, the old billboards encouraging people to report corruption and accountability were in storage at bus depots and elsewhere. In talking with folks there, while acknowledging that Thomas was a bit heavy-handed, they largely saw that what he was trying to do was positive, and to make government responsive to the needs of the people as opposed to being a source of employment, etc. He also, and this was quite controversial at the time, forswore donor assistance, even as the Peace Corps relief, seeking to give the West a message about self-reliance. Old Volta, now Burkina Faso, was among the least developed countries. Life expectancy and overall health was abysmal. Education, rudimentary. His argument for not taking assistance was equally controversial. Most of the money that was allocated for these things went to the donor agencies themselves, followed by the host country ministries, and very little of it ended up going to build a clinic or to pay the salary of a teacher. My goodness, Castro must have told him to say such things. Burkina, after Thomas's death and now under Blaise Compaoré, relaxed considerably. Corruption and donors have returned, but the economy has been on a continual upswing. Schools are crowded, and civil servants continue to show up for work on time. His economy is far from being among the most vibrant in Africa, yet its progress, I believe, fundamentally can be traced back to Thomas's efforts at reform. And speaking about Thomas, I mentioned him as we in the political risk business look for governments with sound government policies. So do businesses, investors, and lenders. When you look across the African landscape nowadays, there are more good governments than bad. Some, of course, remain basket cases and take 5 steps backwards, it seems, for everyone forward. Yet, despite the occasional bad headline about this or that African country, companies here in Illinois, including our 3 biggest exporters, Boeing, Caterpillar, and John Deere, all have noted Africa as being high growth and target markets. We're not going to make sales in every one of Africa's countries, but by focusing on those where things are going well, it means that the bottom lines are looking better. They're not alone. A number of well-known U.S. brands now have jumped in the bandwagon to increase sales in Africa. With the middle class now estimated as larger than India's, and a population at 1 billion, and the economy is growing, it's no longer something they can ignore. They also have China to thank. China Incorporated supplanted the U.S. as Africa's largest investor and trading partner. It achieved this effectively in less than a decade. Chinese companies found consumers Western companies didn't think would buy goods, wouldn't have the money. How did Chinese find these consumers? Plain debt relief, the IMF, etc. Formerly pre-debt relief, I believe, a Lebanese trader, a Franco-Cameroonian family firm, a Nigerian close to the presidency, etc., would have dominated the country's imports and exports, giving a cut to every official at the port along the way. With economic reforms, these monopolies were broken, allowing new companies to come in. Chinese firms jumped right in. American companies, all the same now, are finding as they go over to Africa that consumers prefer their products in ways of doing business and that they have a lot in common. And far from the Chinese companies coming in to take everything over, as this was a hyperbole a few years ago, and preying on, in my view, myths about how Chinese firms do business, local businesses boomed. The cell phone story with billions being invested in made in Africa reflects and is a part of that growth in local business. With folks better able to communicate with each other over prices and the goods that they had to sell, Africa's businesses have become the kings of texting, comparing very well with their average American teenager. As a result of all this, what we are seeing today, I believe, is true renaissance in Africa. Private equity firms, including my company's parent, KKR, and our former one, the Blackstone Group, as well as Carlyle and many others, are buying into African firms. 20 years ago, PE firms investing in Africa were few, and the funding was small. 15 years ago, a big Africa fund was $50 million, perhaps $75 million. Now folks are organizing billion-dollar infrastructure funds for Africa. President Obama has, last summer, announced the Power Africa Initiative in Tanzania, the $7 billion effort to stimulate investment in private power projects, and the African Development Bank and others have announced that they're joining this effort with much more additional support, perhaps another $50 billion altogether. There should be even more investment occurring, of course, given the economic improvement and conducive policy environment. But let's recall again that capital is a coward for things. And also that this renaissance has only recently begun, and there are signs that it doesn't run all that deep. I said earlier that the private sector has to continue to grow, or else the risk will be that all things will regress. The governments will step in, all for good reasons, to save the day. Again, this is where my company comes in. Hopefully no one will ever need the political risk or trade credit insurance policies we put together. When calling on these, making a claim, you're dealing with a catastrophe. All your old friends in the host government won't return your calls. Perhaps worse, they've also seized your money and given it to your competitors. In our post-recession world, which has also witnessed the collapse of the Doha World Free Trade Movement, risk seems to be everywhere. It's not confined to doing business in Africa. Worldwide, trade credit insurance issuance is up 4- and 5-fold since 2008. Political risk insurance, which is on investments and loans to companies, trails that growth. But nonetheless, whereas before the recession it seemed to be an option to get this kind of cover, nowadays it's more and more a requirement. Thankfully, as I mentioned before, insurers are open and doing more business in Africa. Down the road, I can see a day where political insurance won't be necessary for some countries, for some projects. In the meantime, I'm happy to discuss any deals you guys might have. In conclusion, the myths associated with doing business have validity. They need to be updated. Things are clearly not as bad as they once were, nor are they universally better everywhere. The Chinese haven't gobbled up Africa for themselves. Instead, what Chinese firms have been able to do in this new Africa, we should be helpful to understand the potential that exists there for more growth and economic opportunity. What Thomas did, others have picked up in their own ways elsewhere, leading to new ways of thinking positive governance. While the IMF and World Bank look to support the next set of programs to preserve the jobs, I would enjoin this audience to discover the business opportunities that await you in Africa to be a part of this economic revolution. It's a big continent, lots of room for all of us. And thanks again to the African Club and to everyone